Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're just giving it a moment or so for our community to get settled into this virtual production space. We are so excited that you are here today. So settle in and get ready for a dynamic conversation with my guest co-host today. I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the founder and lead principal consultant of NWC, shouting out the NWC team today, who works tirelessly week after week after week and have done so for the past 5 years to bring the Intentional Conversations podcast experience to each of you so that we can learn with and from each other, deepen our knowledge and understanding of all things diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership, and business. And we're just so glad that you have decided to spend this hour with us. If you would, go to the chat and let us know where you are joining the conversation from today. I can tell you that that is always a treat for us to be able to see the different geographies that are represented. We have folks that join us not only from within the US, but even also we have occasional visitors from outside of the US, and we are thrilled. If you also desire for this community to connect with you beyond this hour of time, I invite you to share in the chat your LinkedIn information. That lets us know that you're willing to be connected beyond this hour. And my team is going to share my LinkedIn because I am delighted anytime someone from our podcast community reaches out to be connected on LinkedIn. I see Charlotte, North Carolina is represented. So I love that. Continue to place into the chat where you're joining us from. I also want you to know that we go live on LinkedIn. So we have a community of individuals that will join our podcast by LinkedIn Live. And so I want to say hello to each of you. And I also want you to know that you can use the comment section as you are engaged in today's episode. And if any reflections or sentiments come up for you, then share them there because we are bringing all of that discussion into our chat over here in Zoom so that we all can be connected as one big happy family. I see you, Chicago. Thank you for being here today. I see you, Minneapolis. Fantastic. Keep sharing those geographies in which you're represented today. I also want you to know that at NWC, we really truly value disability inclusion. So because of that, we have enabled the closed caption feature for anyone that could be benefited by closed caption. So that is our way of showing up. And I also want you to know that if you're here, a part of our Zoom community, we love to see smiling faces. It's not something that we require, but cameras being on is a treat for us. It helps us to get proximate to each other. But if you're joining in just an auditory capacity, as you're listening in, multitasking, we are grateful nonetheless. And we're so glad that you're here with us. Okay, I see you, California. Fantastic. Welcome again to Intentional Conversations podcast. We are celebrating 5 years, a big milestone. So let the conversations begin. Welcome. Let the conversations begin, and that is precisely what we're about to do. If you're just joining us, I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and I am your host for Intentional Conversations. As I have shared throughout this year so far, we're celebrating 5 years. That's a big milestone for us, and so we are taking advantage of that by making sure that our community understands how in which we are leaning into this wonderful milestone. And there are special events that are taking place each quarter this year. These are evening episodes that we are referring to as the reunion episodes for Intentional Conversations. And so I hope you'll stay plugged in to all the many ways in which you can engage with our community. We are still in the month of March, and it is Women's History Month. And so we continue to lean into all the many wonderful ways that women contribute to our society at a high level. So I encourage you to place into the chat maybe 1 or 2 women that you deeply admire, that you think is doing amazing work. And let the high vibrations of all of those recognitions to allow each of us as women to feel affirmed and protected and valued and appreciated for all that we bring to society. Place those names into the chat. Now, while you're doing that, I also want you to know that one of the things we do at NWC is we like to recognize national observances. And so for this month, it is also National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. You heard me share that at NWC. We really do show up for disability inclusion in many ways. And part of that is making sure that you are aware of the national observance that's taking place this month. Okay, now, if you're new to our community, then maybe you aren't familiar with the fact that I released book number 3 2 years ago at the end of January. And that book is Inclusion Uncomplicated, a transformative guide to simplify DEI. It is available in audio, it's available in hard copy, and now it's available in paperback. And if you have not yet secured your copy, I hope that you will do so. It is a great tool and resource, and we're finding a lot of gratitude in hearing how organizations and people are using this to help deepen their knowledge and their skill sets around all things that can feel very complicated, which makes us sometimes sit on the sidelines, where in actuality, this tool is a great resource right now where we need to be 10 toes down, going in deeper. So I hope that you will see this as a resource available for you. And speaking of resources at NWC, we really do value being able to bring learning experiences to our community. So I have 4 LinkedIn learning courses that are available, and I want you to be invited to go and check those resources out, share them out with your network if you think that someone in your community would find value in being a part of those learning experiences. And we are just grateful. We have over 60,000 learners that have taken the collective of these 4 courses. And so I'm so incredibly grateful. 2 new programs that we're offering this year at NWC. One is called Boundless. This is a women's community of practice. It's centered on well-being, empowerment, leadership, and specifically we're targeting women of color. We know that right now women of color are facing a really hard time navigating the complexity of all that's happening in this current political landscape, but we want to show up for those women. We want to make sure that they feel affirmed, that they feel a sense of safety and community, and are really well supported in all the ways that can help them thrive and show up at their best. So my team is going to place into the chat a link for Boundless, and we hope that you will take advantage of learning more and signing up potentially to be a part of the cohort that's going to be launching in May. One final and additional opportunity that we are leaning into at NWC is our storytelling cultural framework. Storytelling and sharing of personal narratives is not new to any of us, but what we have found is that not enough organizations are leveraging storytelling and being intentional to build it into the infrastructure and culture of the organization as a way to make decisions, to create a sense of belonging, to bridge those connection points where we need to in order to build up our empathy and our compassion and support for one another. Well, we have recognized that this is a huge opportunity, and we have a great methodology that we would love to bring and to incorporate into your organization. So reach out to us. We'll share the link into the chat, and we'd love to be in conversation about how this could transform your workplace. Now, let me give you just a little bit of what you can look forward to in a couple of weeks by way of our upcoming guests. We have my friend, she's also a consultant partner with NWC, Dia Khanna, and she's joining us on March 21st. I hope that you will mark your calendars and plan to be here with us for that conversation. And then rounding out the month of March, we have Tommy Paris is going to be joining us on the 28th. And again, another great practitioner in this space. And so join us, join us, join us. Make sure you're sharing it out with others in your network. And we look forward to having you as part of our conversations on those dates. Now, it's my great honor to reach the point in our conversation today where I get the opportunity to provide a formal introduction of our guest co-hosts. I read their bios because it's so important to me for you all to understand the accolades, the credentials, the experiences in which our guest co-hosts show up to today's conversation with. And so today I am going to start with that. And I am so excited because we get to engage today with Ernesto Aguilar. And he is an experienced public media leader specializing in radio programming, audience engagement, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. He is currently executive director of radio programming and content innovation initiatives at KQED, among the most listened to public radio stations in the country. He is joining us today from San Francisco, so it's super, super early there, so I'm incredibly grateful. And then we also have Paige Robnett, who is also a guest co-host today, and she is a dynamic ICF certified leadership coach, facilitator, and strategist. As a change management consultant for Alliant Consulting, she helps clients to navigate complex change by deploying people-first solutions. We love that, humans first, that build high-performing teams and healthy cultures. And so if you've been part of our community, you know what I'm going to ask you to do at this point in time. As I stop sharing my screen, and I bring my friends into the spotlight, I'm going to ask each of you that are here, part of our community, to find those words of affirmation, those accolades, those reactions, those emojis, all the things, right? Place them into the chat. Let's let our guest co hosts know how grateful we are to have them here today with us. And I want to kick us off before releasing our guest co host to greet the audience in their own way. I would like to share a tradition here. So, Ernesto and Paige, one of the things that we always start off with is we love for our guest co-hosts to please share something with us that we would not know from hearing their bios or from looking at their LinkedIn profiles. And so, welcome to you both. And I'm going to say it's Women's History Month. And so, Paige, I'm going to let you go first.
Love
Welcome.
it. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. It's any time that I get to nerd out with Ernesto is just a treat, and then this community is just totally adding on. So happy Women's History Month, everybody. I am Paige Robnett. I'm calling in from Detroit, like Nika mentioned, and I help leaders navigate complex individual change and organizational change. And Nika mentioned in my bio, I am very passionate about helping teams work more effectively together. It's one of the reasons Ernesto and I created that resource that we're going to talk a little bit about later on. But that didn't just come out of nowhere. So the thing that I want to share with you all today is my background. I played basketball for more than 10 years. Well, I still play on the side. I try not to hurt myself out there. But basketball is a really important part of my life, important part of my story. And to me, there's nothing better than being on a team. I feel like I'm floating. It is so joyful. But if you have played sports or if you have been on any team in your life, you know that while there's joy that comes with being on a team, you also know how difficult it can be. And in basketball, even in college, we had 20 people on a team. My coach was not a big fan of making cuts. You have 20 people vying for 5 spots. Only 5 people can be on the court at once. So it is a challenge, and we've learned a lot about what high-performing teams require, right? Proactive and frequent communication, conflict management skills, and building trust with one another. So I'm excited to talk more about that. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for being here, Paige. And I absolutely love that your interesting tidbit is about your basketball history, because I was not walking into this conversation expecting that you would say that. But I love that. And I would imagine that it does bring forth so much continuity in terms of the teamwork that's required and the collaboration when you think about it from a workplace teaming perspective as well. So I can't wait to dig in further and hear much more about it. I will also put a quick plug in that Tommy Paris, who I just mentioned, is going to be our guest co-host on Intentional Conversations at the end of the month on the 28th. She is an NCAA referee, and so her lens is similar. And she's also a practitioner in the space. And so, anyway, as you were talking, I was like, oh, that's a coincidence. In the same month, I have these 2 basketball players who really believe in the teaming concept in terms of how you bring that also to the workplace and culture. So, I love that. Ernesto, I want to bring you in. Share with us your tidbit that we would not know and greet the audience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my name is Ernesto Aguilar. I work here at KQED in San Francisco. We're experiencing one of the rare rainy days that we get here in the city itself. My role here is to do, as Nika, you pointed out, radio programming and content innovation initiatives, but I look at the work that I do as how can we be more relevant in people's lives? How can we continue to foster the connections that we have with our audiences? I'm going to jump a little bit past what you've mentioned in that in my LinkedIn bio, there's a remark in there that talks about how my life was transformed by public media. And I want to share a little bit more of that story because it doesn't get into it there, just to remind those of you who are beacons in your communities how important the interactions that you might not think that much about reflect onto people's lives and then may end up shaping them. So I grew up in East Houston. I'm not from the Bay Area. I grew up in Texas, grew up in Houston, and in East Houston, working class Mexican American community there. Houston is the only major metropolitan city without zoning. So as a result, you've got these residential areas that are about 50 minutes away from oil refineries, that are about 5 more minutes away from the ship channel where import export happens. That's where I grew up. I did not know what I was going to do with my life at 16 years old. My father was in the military. Other than being told I wasn't going into the military, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And I wasn't allowed to go to the military because my father was frankly traumatized by his experiences in the military. And one Monday night, around 11 o'clock, at that age of 16 years old, I was bored because growing up around in a military family, we grew up around a lot of military rigor. And one of those traditions was lights out. Now, if you're been in the military, you know this concept. If you're not, it literally means what it sounds like. 9 p.m., the lights go out because you're getting up early. But show of hands, virtually or otherwise, who at 16 is sleepy at 9 p.m.? Because I certainly was not.
No.
And so, but I found I could listen to the radio very quietly and not wake up my very strict father. And on a Monday night around 11 p.m., I landed upon public radio. And it opened up my world from this East Houston barrio into arts and culture and ideas. And it really put me on this path that I am on today. Strangely enough, the week that I was leaving Houston, I actually met the person who was on the air when I was a 16-year-old kid and got a chance to tell him thank you. Because if it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't be leaving Houston, breaking my mother's heart in the process a little bit, and coming to San Francisco to work for the largest public radio station of the country because of this happy accident that transformed what I could become and what I saw for myself. And that's why I remind those of you who are in your communities, those experiences you think you're having with people and these things that you might share, you might not think very much about. But it turns out being something that puts somebody on a road they never would have even imagined for themselves. And so that's my story.
And what a beautiful story that is. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ernesto. There's so much I can say about it. So first, I love the storytelling aspect that you're bringing to today's conversation. You probably heard me reference in the beginning how we really do value storytelling. And so if I'm connecting that to not only the way in which you have greeted this audience and sharing your own personal story, but also about the stories that you heard of others, how inspirational they were, how meaningful they were in connecting you to what eventually became your purpose, right? And then what a great full circle moment to be able to share that directly, that inspiration with the individual that poured that kind of I guess gold and light into you to follow. So I just think that's absolutely, absolutely beautiful. So thank you so much. Okay. So you all have developed a wonderful resource, and I'll just kind of preface this by saying at NWC, part of our service offerings, we do a lot of work around DEI councils, DEI committees, helping to form those, making sure that they are effective, making sure they're thinking strategic about how in which they're activating upon, the essence of the body of work, all of those things. And so when I first discovered that you had a resource that dealt with all of those things, I was really excited. And I remember thinking, oh, I would love to be able to have them onto the podcast. And here we are today. So I want you to talk about those resources. And actually, as you talk about them, help us to understand how organizations have been using them, how individuals have been empowered to upskill around their ability to serve in a capacity in that manner within their respective organizations. And maybe even some other insights that could help this audience who's maybe thinking about how can I now plant a seed within my organization to get something like this in place as we are continuing to protect the work, sustain the work at all costs. And so I want to turn it over to the two of you to share all those things that I just kind of prompted you around.
No doubt. It is such an important conversation that we're having here, Nika, just about, and I go back to exactly what you've said. This is about connecting people. It's about culture. It's about belonging. It's about trust on a lot of levels. This resource that Paige and I co-authored is the product of a lot of work. Want to make sure to thank our sponsors, Brevity and Wit, and Oigo, a newsletter I work on that talks about public media and DEI and representation. Brevity and Wit, longtime workers in the DEI and the inclusion and belonging space. In the conversations that we had with so many of these organizations and so many different leaders in the DEI space across the nonprofit space, we spoke to over 50 individuals, people who were leading up councils, people who were organizational leaders that were interfacing with councils, those who had been members, and those who were consultants in the space. And it was such an important dialogue to have because a lot of them we found were having a lot of very similar experiences. And one of the things that we found in this is reflected in this image. It is really like a Jenga puzzle. You
Jingle
pull
puzzle.
you pull out one piece
Yeah.
and it can be very shaky. And things change within an organization, and it can be a balancing act to a great degree. Leadership can change in councils, organizational priorities may change, political and cultural winds may change, but the work still needs to maintain and still needs to continue. And so as a result, that balancing act, as we're experiencing today and as we experienced last year and the year before and the year before, because there are always winds of change that happen every single year, it is incumbent upon those of us who are passionate about community and about leadership and about development and culture change to remember that this is not something that ends up getting shifted by those winds, but needs to remain consistent.
Ernesto, thanks. I want to build on what you're saying by this Jenga image. Every time I see it, I have a physical reaction to it because I think about every volunteer, staff, council, committee, task force, working group I've ever been on, and my heart starts to race because my experience in the past is it hasn't been good. It's been quite stressful and disappointing and burnout and overwhelm and so there's a personal connection to this and Ernesto and I wanted to create a resource that we wish we had when we were in that seat, but we also help advise a lot of other staff, councils, committees out there, and we wanted to share the wealth of all of the lessons that we were learning. And Ernesto mentioned we had the privilege of gathering data from more than 50 people, right? Executives, consultants, leaders, team members, and we were floored by the honesty and the passion in which people shared their experiences. And looking at all the data, we were able to really, it took a couple iterations. It didn't just quite look like this, but we were able to really visualize in a way what we were hearing from staff in terms of, well, what does successful culture change look like? If we want to make our culture healthier and safer and more inclusive and more fair, what is the journey that we are on? Because we are totally overwhelmed right now. One council I worked with starting 4 years ago, they had an action plan of 35 initiatives they were working on, right? So it's a lot. It's a lot, and you'll see in the resource that we have, it's a lot. But what we were able to really see is there's a typical, now change is nonlinear, we all know this, but there's a typical pattern that organizations move through. When organizations are resistant to change, there are some typical indicators that we see at the highest level. Staff feel frustrated, leaders are stressed, both groups are in fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
When organizations become reactive, typically that's when I'm brought in as a consultant, not always, but typically there's a lot of burnout. Leaders are really anxious and there's just a sense of exhaustion and overwhelm across the board. Being proactive about culture change is where we start to see, or when organizations start to feel progress. Now it's not perfect, it's never going to be perfect, but there's some hope, even if there's skepticism, there's some curiosity, even if People are tired. There's some cautiously optimistic energy happening. And we learned from the data that we gathered that being strategic, just like you would be about any other area of your business, treating culture change and being strategic about it, that's the goal. That's the goal. And this is possible. It is possible that we can have it. I know I don't think it's naive of me to think of the feelings that I had when I was playing basketball, the joy and the respect, looking forward to practice every day. It doesn't mean it's easy, but there's a joy and it's possible. And what I want to call out here, we've talked about it actually a couple times already today, is this word trust. That's the through line that jumped off the page for us as we were going through that data. We learned that at the end of the day, trust is the currency of change. And it the more trust leaders build with staff, and it goes both ways. Of course, there's that power dynamic, so that's most important, but staff building trust with leaders, the less friction and the more likely organizations are going to be able to move through this culture change process.
Yeah, 100%. I want to just kind of socialize a little bit around what I'm hearing and react to it a bit. And I suspect that there's probably more to this guide that you're going to want to share with us. And so just hold that thought for a moment. And by the way, we have shared into the chat a link for this resource guide. And so I hope that you all will capture that. And we'll also, of course, replace it into the comments section for those who are joining us LinkedIn Live. So first of all, I want to start back with the visualization of Jenga. When I tell you that, yes, thank you for going back to it, because this is such a great analogy to talk about this process, because you are so right in that every aspect of our nervous system gets activated when we're doing this work, right? Because it's hard, because it's complex, because maybe we aren't well supported, because we are on our own learning journeys, right? And so I love this analogy. And so I think there's also something to be said for when we recognize that we are constantly activating all portions of our nervous system, we also have to make sure we're incorporating ways that people are able to lean into self-care while they're doing this work, right? And I say that because the reality is, for most organizations that will have a DEI council or committee, I know the language is kind of used interchangeably, those individuals are doing that work from a volunteer perspective, right? There may not necessarily be paid or compensated for that work, at least not in a financial perspective. Sometimes if organizations are at least forward thinking, they are trying to build it into the performance evaluation. They are trying to provide maybe other perks, but again, that's a whole nother conversation, which maybe we'll get into a little bit as well. But the other thing too is when individuals are assigned or appointed, or maybe they are voluntold to serve in this capacity, the assumption is that they're walking in with already a level of skill sets around how to do this. And most often they are individuals that are part of, I like to say, underestimated populations, right? And so they are feeling the pain of having to deal with the lived experiences while also trying to do the work to make the culture better. And that is a hard place to be. The other thing that I will share is I love how you connected trust as one of the core foundations of why we need to move through those different stages, yes, from 1 to 4, resistant to strategic. You know, you said that trust is really foundational to it. I like to talk about trust as being the gateway to empowerment and activation. And that's ultimately what you're looking for, empowerment and activation. And not just activation of any type of activity. I heard you mention, Paige working with a group that had maybe 35 big initiatives. That's a lot. That can feel like boiling the ocean, right? And so we have to also make sure that we're sending the strong message that we need for people who are aligned with these council efforts to think strategically. And when you think strategically, you are gravitating towards impact and not activity. Activity will yield 35 initiatives, right? But if you're thinking strategically and impactful, you're going to cull that down. But the results are going to be greater because the quality of the output is going to be more meaningful, which helps to facilitate that trust. And then now we're seeing some good momentum and traction. So I'm going to pause there because maybe there's some things that you're going to share with us that's going to take us to the natural progression of all that I just kind of unpacked. But I would love for you to keep going in your presentation. But thank you for giving me that moment just to kind of socialize around what was coming up for me.
No, thank you. And I'm looking at Ernesto here too, just nodding. I mean, you are speaking our language, right? And for anybody on the call, right, that has been in an experience like this, we know what playing that Jenga game looks like with shaky hands, inserting and pulling out pieces, right? It is no joke. It is no joke. So we do have one
Yeah.
more slide. And
Awesome.
this is in the resource. It is a summary, is a visual summary of more data that we collected. We were really curious in the resource guide. We won't go through it now. You'll be able to see we pulled out not only the benefits of having a volunteer staff, giving staff a voice through this type of council. We also have the barriers too. We wanted to be really honest about that. And my favorite thing about the resource is the storytelling piece in the resource. We have some powerful direct quotes from people who were incredibly honest about their experience. So please check those out and learn from your colleagues who generously shared. We also heard about the success factors. And this
Yeah.
is truly, if you remember one thing even from today, I think it's that piece about trust. Okay, so two things. One thing about trust as that accelerator, the activator, like you said, Nika, but these are our 6 success factors that we found, behaviors that build trust with staff and systems that build trust with staff. And overwhelmingly, we heard from staff. Now, this is a change management best practice, right? To change your organization, it's the responsibility of the people with the most power. It's the responsibility of leaders.
Absolutely.
So this image here is really geared to the leadership team at organizations to say, before you invest a ton of time and resources and ask your staff to invest that time and resources, make sure that you're mature enough, that you're proactive about building trust with staff and systems that build trust with staff. So the behaviors, right? Make sure that leaders are, for the most part, no one's going to be perfect, right? But have a genuine curiosity and willingness to listen. Leaders are committed. They communicate, they participate, they show up, and then they're grateful. They express gratitude. That was a huge one we heard in our research. And Ernesto, I'll let you talk about the systems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nika, I've been the corgi over here just waiting to jump on every single word as you've been mentioning, because there's so many just jewels that you've shared with us. And I think that the part that you mentioned about so many staff doing this on a volunteer basis or a voluntold basis, and how organizations begin to recognize that a bit more and figure out ways to either budget and provide the resources, or to your point, delivering perks, making sure that there is an organizational priority to recognize the work that goes into this for every staff member. So having those systems in place where an organization can begin to recognize their staff or to budget for the efforts that staff are putting into this is crucial. In addition, I think it's so important, and one of the things that so many of the respondents that we spoke to reflected was there really needs to be a foundation of strategy. What does the organization see in terms of its vision for this? Not as a fly-by-night priority, not as we're chasing a trend, but what does this mean to us as an organization and the culture that we are hoping to create and we aspire to create for the next generation of staff and leadership beyond the people who are in the chairs right now? And then finally, I think that something that really stood out for me personally was the number of respondents who reflected that structure was critical. It's easy enough for staff, to your point a little bit earlier, Nika, to jump into this work because they care about it or because there's a perception that they care about it, but sometimes not having the support and the structure to actually make those things happen, the hopes and the dreams that we would like to see for our organizations are frankly hobbled. They become a lot harder. They lead to burnout, as you pointed out a little bit earlier, and they just make things so much more difficult. And so without those systems in place, organizations can falter. So it really is incumbent upon leaders to look at themselves and say, how can we behave in ways that are supportive of our staff? And also, how can we build structures that maintain and grow the trust with staff so that we can build these organizations up for years to come?
I love this so much. So I want to keep this up here for a second. I want to kind of pontificate on some things that are coming up for me. This is so good, by the way. I hope that you all are really going to leverage this great resource. So the first thing is the structure, as you just talked about, Ernesto. I cannot agree more how crucial that is. And that includes the onboarding, the offboarding, the succession planning. What are the rules of engagement? What are the community norms as we are trying to drive change? Because you ultimately should have a group of individuals that are bringing different perspectives, right? And so you need a way of being able to work through the different perspectives to be able to land at a place that organization-wide is going to be best served. And so when you talked about it's not just passion alone, it's not going to get us there. I agree. I think that I often say that it takes both will and skill. So maybe part of that, the perks that are being offered in absence of, financial compensation would be the professional development to upskill these individuals around change management, around, issues of workplace culture, all the things that really can help them be best positioned to be part of this enacted group to help move this work forward, right? I think that's critical. The other thing is, when you think about structure, we cannot forget about structure as it relates to what type of power and authority is given to this group of individuals that have been enacted with this level of responsibility. I am not a fan of responsibility for outcomes without power and authority. And part of that power and authority relates to the structure because it may require that who does this now enacted council report into? Right? Who are they getting the direction from the top down? Is there also an advisory group of executive leaders that are also able to download some of the intricacies of the organization strategy, vision, and goals so that way their efforts can align? I mean, I know I'm like preaching to the choir because both of you are like, yes, 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 yes.
Keep
But I just
going,
want to
keep going.
but I want to bring these points to the conversation because what I have found and working in this space is that one of the first things that organizations will do once they have decided that I want to enhance workplace culture, I want to have more inclusivity built into how in which we operate, is they will say, okay, let's create a DEI council. And they'll start just, identifying people to or having people to raise their own hands. And now you have this group of excited, eager individuals, but they have no pathway of how do I now, exercise whatever activation methods to be able to be effective. And so I often say that if you really are looking for this group to create the change, you have to start well in advance of even identifying who you want to be on the group to even make sure that that process is well thought out. How are you onboarding and identifying, right? And it can't just be a volunteer thing. And so I could go on, but I'm going to pause there and I'll just say this last thing before I'll let you kind of jump into where you want to take us to next. But I love that now a lot of what I have been sharing in my practice, but there is this evidence-based data and resource that can support a lot of the best practices or leading practices for being able to strategically and effectively leverage a DEI council. Because many people are of the persuasion that DEI councils, they don't really serve a good purpose or just kind of window dressing. And that can be true if we aren't following all of these great prescriptive suggestions and recommendations that are formed out of the evidence-based data that you all have graciously collected and made available to each of us.
Absolutely. I want to call out one of the comments in the chat that talked about cultural humility. And I think it's an important
Yes.
part of trust. But also to remind everybody when you're thinking about cultural humility, to think about across difference. And Paige can certainly reflect on this as well. But one of the things that we found in talking with so many respondents is that part of the culture is also understanding that leadership is fundamentally different than staff, particularly for veteran leaders. I think there's we found that there's at times a perception that I understand what the rank and file go through because I was from there. The rank and file don't perceive people as that anymore. And so there's this disconnect at times that requires you, as Paige pointed out in point number one, being genuinely curious, asking people
Yeah.
where they're at and really listening and taking that to heart and responding and acting in a time-bound and an accountable fashion to people based on that feedback. But being curious and being open and being humble enough to say, I'm in a different place and there are all kinds of differences I might not necessarily understand, but I want to know more to the greatest benefit of the organization I'm here for.
Yeah, no, I love that. Cultural humility is key. And so what that means is instead of just filling up all of the convenings of members that are comprised of DEI councils to just talk about executing the work, let's also build in time to hold space for people to learn with and from each other just through conversations, through storytelling, through ways in which we can help foster that level of curiosity. So that is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit further about this. I mentioned before that it's important for that structure. And I guess, and again, that was kind of coming off of Ernesto, what you were sharing when you were dealing with the systems portion of it. But I think it's equally important for people to understand what is not or what should not be the task, the responsibility of a DEI council, because I think that is equally important to what they should be doing. And I'll give you a quick example, and then I would love for the two of you maybe to add to the list and tell me what are some other things that you feel like DEI councils need to be watchful of to not be perceived in that light as being responsible for. And that is, I like to say the grievance board, right? A DEI council should not be perceived as if there's any type of infraction that has happened to me that relates to maybe personnel, or and even if I can see that there's a connection point to the lack of inclusion, that I'm going to now just kind of filter that and report that and grieve to the DEI council. So anyway, I hope that frames my question in a way that allows you to jump in and share some other thoughts about that.
Oh yeah. There's a lot more in the resource, but the two ones that are really, or I guess the biggest one that is sticking out to me is a council that is expected to do and own every little thing related to culture in the organization.
Right.
A great example is that organization that I shared with 35 initiatives. That's not a one-off, that's not an outlier. Unfortunately, that is my experience when I enter. That's oftentimes the case where these folks who have passion or have been voluntold, and many of whom have not been trained in change management best practices or project management best practices, or even like meeting facilitation and design, they're being asked to do everything. So the biggest learning, or I guess the lesson learned there is taking that time. Nika, I love how you talked about it's not a short amount of time when you're preparing council. It's
right.
what I've talked about. We're talking potentially months. Now, you add more resources, you can accelerate the process, but slowing down there, and in that charter, my most successful and sustainable councils that have really scaled and actually moved from a reactive to a proactive level of maturity, they have in their charters, under the purpose section, what this council is responsible for and what it is not responsible for.
Yes.
Just to clarify to staff, like, we are not HR. We are not grievance. It really clarifies for staff, like, this is a solutions focused council focused on these three areas, right? And some of those areas for the council I've worked with for 4 years now, their main focus areas are advising the executive team on transparency. Now, they're not the decision makers. They're just the advisors. The next one is staff connection and belonging. They're hybrid all over the country. So they're being very intentional about that. And the next one is staff recognition and rewards. And they're advisors. They're an advisory council. And it has made, this is the one that started off with 35. It's never perfect, but it has
always evolving.
It has been a game changer. This organization has, over 4 years, many of their employee engagement scores have improved by more than 30%. And the one that sticks out to me the most is, I trust leaders in this organization has improved by more than 30%. So they are still on a journey. They are working towards being more strategic every day, but change is really possible.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Ernesto.
Nika, it was so interesting you talked about this grievance conversation. One of the respondents that we talked to in this thought paper talked about how they had heard leadership referring to their group as a complaint department. And I think that it's an important thing to think about. And it's the thing I always remind counselors to be to think about too, as much as you can, is perception management, not just what you're doing and the number of initiatives you want to do, which shouldn't be 35. That's a lot. That's a big, big list. Try to pare it down into a few actionable kinds of items that you can build upon and see successes with, but also begin to think about your internal networks. Think about
Yes.
how you are seen. Think about your advocates, who are your allies in the organization, who can be very frank with you about how you are seen. So that therefore you can begin to address those kinds of perceptions in a way that's only going to benefit you long term. Because if some people think about that way, they're just giving voice to it. There's more than likely other individuals who could perceive things that way. So how are you engaging with staff? How are you regularly communicating as a council? How are you listening to the needs of staff? How do you represent? And from there, really think about how you can most actively engage with leadership. Maybe that's a quarterly check-in. Maybe that's an annual check-in. Maybe that's a monthly check-in with an executive sponsor, if you have an executive sponsor in your organization, and really getting a really clear lay of the land so that you as a council can begin to think about your agenda with an eye to what are organizational priorities that we can connect into, and what are organizational priorities that need someone to say, hey, we really need to add this, or you should think about this, or here's an initiative that we have that we feel like needs to be at the table.
Yeah, yeah, that goes back to the advisory role, and then but positioning them to be able to have that pathway of information flow, right? The feedback loop. So I want to give our audience an opportunity to jump in here. So I will let you know that momentarily we will shifting over, and if you have your questions or comments or anything that you would like to contribute to the conversation, if you're part of our Zoom community, we want to invite you to do that. You can do so by using the raise hand feature, and that lets me know that I can invite you to unmute yourself and share. And if your camera is on, I will also add you to the spotlight. If not, go to the chat, place your question there. We'll try to get in as many as we can as time will allot for. If you're on LinkedIn Live, do not worry. Go to the comment section, place your questions there. We're watching it closely and we'll bring it over to this discussion. But I want to give you time to percolate on that. So I'm going to go to the next question and then I will look to see if we have some takers on that offering. I want to move back into the conversation around the time commitment that serving in this capacity could require. And I'm also mindful that sometimes the barriers has to do with the lack of communication organization wide, right? So let's say someone's identified to serve on the council and then they have their routine meetings, they have other outside of the meeting time that they need to devote to getting stuff done. But then maybe they're getting the side eye from like a teammate or maybe like even their supervisor because it's like, well, why are you so busy? Because I haven't given you a whole lot of stuff, or I don't, and that becomes these tension points, right? And so let's talk about what organizationally needs to happen for the individuals who are being tapped, appointed, voluntold, whatever it is, to serve and serve effectively.
I think communication is so key.
Yeah.
Expectation setting with supervisors. And what that means is that the supervisors of supervisors communicate most actively about the staff commitment there. Because I can try as a staff member to manage up to my supervisor, but ultimately, to me, this is a top leadership conversation. If top leadership sees this as a priority, it's important to ensure that if you're on a council or you're working with a staff committee of some sort, that you communicate to your executive sponsor or leadership that sees the value in this to make sure that it is clarified in as clear terms as possible the level of commitment that the staff member is going to be engaged in this work with, and also that some time will be allotted to this. Because Nika, I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes there's a perception of bosses
Right.
that you would say, oh, what are you doing? Or why there's other things need to get done. That there's a very big communication gap that's very clear there,
Yeah.
in which they don't really, the supervisor clearly doesn't understand what the staff member has potentially been asked to do this work and what that actually means for their day to day.
Yes. And so the communication strategy starts well before people are appointed. I often say, let's get those supervisors involved because maybe there's a nomination process, right? Upon how in which you're identifying who's going to be tapped for this. And if the supervisors are invited into that exercise, they're already well aware of what this charge and this council is intended to do, right? And so I often say that that is the biggest opportunity to try to prevent something like that in terms of the tension points with feeling like, why are you going off doing this extracurricular stuff when you have your primary responsibilities that should always take precedent, right? So how are we level setting around that?
Yeah.
I also think the communication strategy serves this purpose of getting everyone in the organization aligned with why does this group exist? Because resistance, which was number one, I believe in your chart, is a lack of clarity. Resistance is always a lack of clarity. So if we are on the set, making sure people understand why we are establishing this council, what is it intended to do, who it's reporting into, right? Then I think that people have a greater appreciation and it lessens the incidence of the side eyes when someone leaves to say, I have to go and do this council activity or whatever it is, right? So I think that's really key. Do you want to jump in, Paige? I can see it on your face.
The side eye is such an important, I'm sure people listening, right, are feeling it in their bones, right? It's oftentimes barriers to these types of working teams. They're not like necessarily overt. It's more passive
Yes.
or invisible within the system. They're hard to see. But if you read some of the sentiment that we have in the report, you'll see you nailed it, Nika, that it's the little behaviors of resistance that really not only prevent staff from participating, but also ultimately make staff leave, go elsewhere,
Yeah.
completely disengage. And I love this piece about a communication, 5 exclamation points after that. And maybe this is inherent within communication, but I also want to pull out the best practice of communication and documentation. I think it's under the umbrella, but
Mhm.
that has been such a critical success factor that we've learned because most times leaders aren't trying to be malicious, they're busy, they forget what
Right.
they're committed to. So I want to share an example. I've joined Alliant Consulting a few months ago, and it probably won't surprise folks to hear that I had an idea for a capability working group, a staff working group, but I've been around the block. So I pulled
Yeah.
out this handy resource, and to my team, I love the teammates that I work with. We have 3 working groups that we launched last month, and we've been really moving through this process. And our charter, which we just launched this week, it took us weeks to build this charter, but we have a whole section in there around time commitment. Staff
Mhm.
members are expected to give 8 hours per month, so 2 hours per week to this working group, more or less. What happens if you are doing more? What happens if you're doing less? Let us know. Here are the communication pathways. And we had executive sponsor sign off on that. So
Yeah.
just not now things are going to happen just like they will with any team, but we can go back to this and say, here's what we agreed upon and let's make it better.
It's
Yeah.
important.
Be proactive is what I'm hearing. Yes,
Yeah.
Ernesto.
No, it's important as well, just for those of you who are leading this work in your organizations, to think about writing these things into charters or documenting this somewhere as a recruitment strategy. I am a former co-chair of the DEI Council here. And one of the things that we always aspire to is we would like to have cross-departmental representation. We want the newsroom, we want facilities, we want operations, development, all of the departments and divisions within the organization to participate. But for those who don't necessarily engage in this all the time, but whose voices are really critical, being transparent about the commitment that they will need to talk with their supervisors about, and so that they understand personally what they're going to be asked to do, is going to be a game changer in terms of bringing in new voices who are so essential for all of our organizations to be even stronger. Sometimes those of us, we sometimes take for granted that the people who we would love to have participating just aren't always flowing in these spaces as much, but their perspective is incredibly valuable. And they may just not understand that, oh, I need to make 4 hours a month 8 hours a week, whatever it may be, out of my workday to do this so that I can really be my full self and show up as fully as possible in these conversations. Just communicating that and being very clear is going to be a really important way to recruit brand new blood into your staff council or committee.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think that there's a huge responsibility on leadership within the organization to be creative and committed to finding the space and the strategies to allow the individuals who are serving to be able to do the work. Because otherwise, then it feels like now I'm just taking on a second job that I'm not being compensated for, but all my other primary responsibilities are still continuing to pile up and pile up. So I think that that is a big opportunity that is often missed in organizations. I also want to talk about, because I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to keep going for it. But I also want to talk about the importance of engaging throughout the entire organization. It is one thing to have a group of people that are enacted to do this work. Usually those are people who already drink the Kool-Aid, if you will, right? But I think that engaging others is critically important. So how do both of you feel, and maybe you talk about this in your resource guide, but address the idea of having like subcommittees that then are comprised of people outside of the standard quote unquote council or committee as a way to get additional involvement, voices at the table. Is that something that you recommend?
I'm very curious to hear what Ernesto has to say. The classic consultant answer, right, is it depends. And that is true, but I will, share my thoughts on it. I would say that those level of subcommittees are the more opportunities or creative strategies you have to have intentional feedback loops with
Yeah,
staff outside the council, the better. And the caveat to that is I would say I don't work, or I have not worked with a council who is as mature enough, who is mature enough to be able to do that. Mature enough, especially in terms of resources. They have the executive leadership support. It didn't come right away, but now they do. They have a bomb charter, right? They have a great roadmap and strategy, but they lack the resources to be able to do that. If you're an organization that has those resources, go for it.
yeah. Ernesto, your thoughts? Any adds to
So
that?
I think that it's absolutely a possibility. To Paige's point, it really needs to be strategic with an eye to what will we gain out of it, and just importantly, what will the individual gain, and what are the ancillary benefits? For example, say I would like to, in our DEI council, I would like to have a recruitment committee. Perhaps there are people who we could look at as potential members. Would
Mhm.
love to get their voices in the room. That's an opportunity, one, to get them introduced, but also
Right.
for them to understand some more of the processes. In other cases, there might be a conversation around, say, a charter or a governance issue of some sort. Well, maybe we need to get in the CEO to come in for a bit because ultimately the CEO is going to have to sign off on this anyway. Let's not have any surprises. Let's have that conversation now and invite this person to be a part of the committee. Doesn't have to be necessarily voting, could be ex officio. However, the council decides it's going to engage non-members in its work or other staff members in the work. But again, try to think about those key benefits for the committee, key benefits for the people being brought in, and then the ancillary benefits for both sides.
Okay, this is like a lightning round question because I do want to give us at least 60 seconds for you two to close this out in whatever way that feels great. But true or false, and why a DEI council alone is going to get the organization where it wants to be in terms of change management?
False.
False.
And why?
I really want to point people to the resource guide because but the resource guide is a great way to show the importance of the other key elements that are needed in there. And the one that comes to mind is that executive leader buy-in and support. And that is a change management that research has shown, ProSci research has shown that the number one success factor for any change effort, it could be implementing AI in your organization or another tool, but that any type of change, especially culture change, start there and everything else will get easier.
Yeah, you're right about it. This work is multi-layered. You can't just stop with the DEI council. Ernesto, did you want to say
The
something?
DEI councils are the canary in the coal mine. They are just one piece of what's happening within an organization that oftentimes bubble up because there are other issues in the organization that frankly deserve address by senior leadership first and foremost.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we are out of time. I want to thank you both for being here. I want to thank our community for showing up as well. Make sure you grab this resource. It has a DEI Council readiness checklist. It has the maturity model, benchmarking tool that we've talked about, and so much other goodness. So make sure you're pulling that out. I want to give you both the final 60 seconds, so 30 seconds each to close us out in whatever way that feels appropriate. I'll start with you, Paige.
I have shared with you the council that I've worked with for more than 4 years, and consistently when I check in with staff about how things are going and what the number one thing is that has moved them from a reactive maturity to proactive, overwhelmingly the answer is executive leaders, senior leaders show up less defensively with staff. They're more curious, and I'm not kidding you all, I have chills when I say this. Executive leaders, they're going through a hard period of time right now.
Yeah.
Executive leaders held 8 listening sessions with council members and with staff the past 4 weeks. So those executive leaders have put in the work, and they have results to back it up.
Ernesto.
I will end this where I started, which is to say thank you to all of you who are here joining us in this space for the work that you do. Never take for granted the work that you are doing and the impact that you are having on your fellow staff members, on your leaders, and on your organizations, because chances are you may not see in 5, 10, 20, 30 years the impact you have had. You may not even be there for it, but quietly they will be saying thank you. So very much appreciate all the work that you do in your organizations.
Absolutely. And the work has never been more important than now. Thank you. Thank you so very much. We look forward to seeing you again next week for another episode of Intentional Conversations. Have a healthy and safe weekend. Bye-bye.